Hello, and welcome to Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. My name is Ben Hauk, and I'm pleased to be able to introduce the 27th installment in our ongoing series. For our November episode, we depart from our usual format as IGS President Lance Strate shares the Balvant Parekh Memorial Lecture that he recently delivered in India for the Balvant Parekh Centre for General Semantics and Other Human Sciences. Let's hear what he has to say.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. My name is Lance Strate. I'm the president of the Institute of General Semantics, and I'll be flying solo this month. And speaking of flying, I recently flew to India to take part in a celebration at the Balvant Parekh Centre for General Semantics and Other Human Sciences. And I should add that this is one of a number of general semantics societies and centers that have been established all around the world. And I do want to add that the Institute of General Semantics is happy to assist anyone looking to set up a center or a society or anything related to general semantics. We're here and we're ready to assist you in doing that, and we're also ready and happy to assist groups that are already in existence devoted to general semantics. Now, as for the Parekh Centre, it's located in the city of Baroda, which is in the state of Gujarat, the region in India that Mahatma Gandhi was from. And the center was established back in 2009. It was founded, the founder that it's named for, Balvant Parekh, was a wealthy industrialist and entrepreneur who passed away in 2013. And now, in celebration of the centenary of his birth, I was invited to come to India and speak at the center. So I arrived in Mumbai on November 9th and gave a talk at the Indian Institute of Technology in Mumbai before continuing on to Baroda the next day. There I met with the director of the center, Prafulla Kar, who I'd met once before, or several times before, once when he came to New York for our annual Alfred Korzybski Memorial Lecture, and one time when I was at the center previously. And this time, for the first time, I met the center's present academic fellow, Ajmita Kundu. And while I was at the center, I delivered the 10th Balvant Parekh Memorial Lecture. That was on the afternoon of November 11th. The lecture was entitled The Message, the Meaning, and the Medium. And then the next morning, November 12th, I gave a short talk entitled Korzybski's Structural Differential, Plato's Cave, and the Shield of Perseus, Ways of Knowing Our Ways of Knowing. And then, as for something a little lighter, that afternoon I did a poetry reading. Anyway, for this episode of Semantic Reactions, I thought I'd record a studio version of my Balvant Parekh Memorial Lecture. And I know this is a departure from our usual conversational format, but I hope you find it worthwhile nonetheless. And whether you do or not, in any event, here it is, my lecture entitled The Message, the Meaning, and the Medium. It's a great pleasure for me to return to the Balvant Parekh Centre, and a great honor to be invited to give this year's Balvant Parekh Memorial Lecture. When I was last here in 2009, I had the privilege of meeting with Balvant Parekh in Mumbai, and he told me that he first became acquainted with general semantics in 1980 through reading the journal Etc., a review of general semantics. Now, back in 1980, Neil Postman was the editor of Etc., and that same year, I had begun working on my doctoral degree with Postman in his media ecology program at New York University. In other words, while I was half a world away from Mr. Parekh, we were connected as readers and as fellow citizens in a common republic of letters. I appreciate the fact that this institution that bears his name is the Balvant Parekh Centre for General Semantics and other human sciences. As the president of the Institute of General Semantics, it means a great deal to me and many others to know that there are other organizations in many different corners of the world that are dedicated to the discipline established by the founder of our institute, Alfred Korzybski. And I want you to know that the IGS stands ready to support the center in any way that we can. I also want you to know that I very much appreciate the fact that the Balvant Parekh Centre is devoted to other human sciences in addition to general semantics. While Korzybski's aim was to establish a teachable system that was sufficient to solve many of the psychological and social problems that plagued humanity in his time, and continue to do so in ours, it was never meant to put an end to all other inquiry into the human condition. For that matter, Korzybski did not coin the term non-Aristotelian as a designation to be applied to general semantics alone. Indeed, he acknowledged the existence of other non-Aristotelian perspectives, approaches, and systems, both in the STEM fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and in other human sciences as well. Now, as you may know, I am a scholar in the field of communication, which is one of those other human sciences and one that has been significantly influenced by general semantics. Arguably, communication is the most human of the human sciences, and I say this because the one characteristic that is most unique to human beings is human communication, by which I mean symbolic communication and language in particular. And just in case any of you want to object by noting that the scientific name of our species is Homo sapiens, which means wise hominid, I would ask you whether you really believe that wisdom really is the universal characteristic of our species. That was certainly not Korzybski's conclusion, which is why he set about trying to bring a measure of sanity to the human race. If you prefer a looser translation of Homo sapiens as the thinking hominids, I would note that thinking is not unique to humans, and that what is unique about human thought is that much of it, for most of us, is done with language, often in the form of an interior monologue or dialogue. We begin by learning how to speak out loud to others, which also results in us learning how to speak out loud to ourselves, and we eventually learn how to speak to ourselves silently, internalizing speech as thought. And this parallels the way that we learn how to read, first by reading out loud, and then later, at least typically nowadays, learning how to read silently to ourselves. The important point is that language and other kinds of symbols give us tools for thought, and these are the most important tools that we have ever invented. Now, having mentioned tools, some of you may be thinking that tool use in general is the defining characteristic of our species. It is not. As scholars such as Lewis Mumford and Edward T. Hall point out, tool use can also be found within the animal kingdom, and especially as Mumford notes, the primitive dwellings of our prehistoric ancestors pale in comparison to the elaborate constructions built by a variety of species, such as the dams and lodges constructed by beavers, the nests that all manner of birds build for their young, and the hills, mounds, and hives built by ants, termites, bees, wasps, and other insects. While much has been made of the opposable thumb, its original purpose was to serve our tree-dwelling evolutionary ancestors as they climbed and swung through the branches. As for the primates that came to be grounded and had to stand on their own 2 feet, the most important feature of the opposable thumb was not in the crafting of primitive tools. Rather, it was in making it possible for hominids to carry things in their hands rather than carrying things in their mouths as other animals do. And this freed up the mouth for vocalization and for the eventual development of speech. As I like to put it, it is not opposable thumbs that make us human, it is opposable tongues, speech, conversation, dialogue, gossip. I am stressing the importance of speech as a form of symbolic communication because it is, as far as we know, universal to human societies. Now, I hasten to acknowledge that it is not universal to every individual human being, that some lose the capacity for speech, and a few, for various reasons, never develop it. And there are some communities, notably among the deaf, who develop alternatives to speech, not the least being the 300 or more sign languages used in various parts of the world today. But we have never encountered an entire nation, people, or tribe anywhere in the world that does not have a spoken tongue. Not in Africa or the Amazon jungle, or not on an isolated island in the Pacific. Nowhere. Everywhere you go, people talk. The survival value of speech can easily be understood when you consider how one person might warn another of immediate danger. If we relied on signing, you would have to be looking in the right direction, and your view would have to be clear and unobstructed to register the warning. In contrast to line of sight, sound surrounds us. It comes at us from all directions. A cry is much more effective than a gesture at getting the message through to others, no matter the direction. A nonverbal cry communicates that something is going on, which has some utility, while a verbal cry can communicate specific information and instructions such as duck, or run, or hide, or watch out for that hole in the ground. We don't know when language originated because speech has no bones. It leaves no trace behind, no fossils to be found or poetry shards to dig up. Could the origin of the spoken word be as recent as 10,000 years ago? 30,000, 70, 100, 200? Was it unique to modern humans, or did the Neanderthals have some form of speech? Or Homo erectus, or Homo habilis, or the Australopithecines? Theories abound, widely divergent from one another, but at present we have no way to know for certain. What we can say, however, is that speech has great survival value, not only in the ability to deliver a warning, but in its centrality to social cohesion. Speech is what binds human communities together, which is why the anthropologist Robin Dunbar stresses the importance of gossip, not as a frivolous pastime, but as the means of maintaining interconnections and relationships within early bands of humans, which is to say within families, tribes, and clans. Speech is the medium of group cohesion, and through language and symbolic communication, a sense of group identity is forged, as the scholar of rhetoric Kenneth Burke emphasizes. Additionally, language is the basis of what Korzybski referred to as time binding, which he identified as the defining trait of the human race. Through symbolic communication, we are able to store and pass on experience, information, and knowledge to others, and to pass it on from one generation to the next. In this way, we can preserve what is useful, whatever allows us to survive and thrive, and through language we can also evaluate the messages we receive and determine if they have outlived their usefulness or are otherwise erroneous or dysfunctional. For most of human history, or rather prehistory, time binding served the function of homeostasis, preserving tribal societies and oral cultures by granting them the flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. But with the addition of forms of notation, especially systems of writing, time binding took off, as we were able to store information outside of collective memory and thereby accumulate much more knowledge than had hitherto been possible. And this made it possible to achieve significant progress, to take increasingly more control of our circumstances and surroundings, and to achieve what has traditionally been referred to as civilization. It is sobering to consider the fact that our species has existed for tens of thousands of years without writing, with only speech, so that, relatively speaking, oral cultures have stood the test of time. By way of contrast, the first writing system, cuneiform, was invented only about 5,500 years ago, a relatively recent historical accident. And therefore, the survival value of the written word remains, at best, uncertain. The invention of writing in turn led to the invention of schooling. Education previously took the form of learning stories and songs and sayings through imitation and apprenticeship, and this type of learning could be accomplished, well, just about anywhere. Writing, on the other hand, required a new kind of specialized setting, one where individuals would have to sit relatively still to learn how to read and learn how to utilize writing surfaces such as clay, wax tablets, papyrus, parchment, and the like. The primary mission of schools has always been to teach reading and writing, and also arithmetic, because at first the first main function of writing was keeping accounts and inventories. Eventually, writing also made it possible to record, edit, and perfect oral poetry and narrative, which made it feasible for the first time to engage in verbatim memorization. Moreover, the study of language and literature originates in the literate cultures of the ancient world. This sort of study was known at one time as grammar, and also later on as philology, and it serves as the foundation of contemporary literary studies as well as linguistics. Writing also gave rise to the sacred text, which in turn makes literacy a sacrament and necessitates forms of exegesis and hermeneutics, such as the Talmud. This in turn serves as the basis of modern science, as scholars in the Antiquity and the Middle Ages argued that God had in fact provided two books for us to read and interpret: Scripture and also nature, the book of Scripture, the book of nature. Writing translates sound into the form of speech, into a visual form, and as literacy takes hold, seeing replaces hearing as the dominant sense by which we obtain knowledge about the world. The scientific method, empiricism, emphasizes the use of the senses to obtain information about our environment, and it is mainly concerned with the visual. This is not only about telescopes, microscopes, and other devices that feature readouts of various kinds. Modern science begins with printed documents, words and numbers, charts, diagrams, tables, and scientific illustrations. Consider the fact that the only way to deal with sound, the only way to deal with sound, is to turn it into a graph or a numerical sequence. As Walter Ong points out, without writing, there is no such thing as study, as there is no text to study, and there is nothing to look up. Writing gives us the ability to separate the message from the messenger and to consider the message on its own terms. As Eric Havelock puts it, writing separates the knower from the known, and that frees people up from the need to memorize and grants them the ability to view and review their words and those of others, and provides the distance needed for critical analysis and evaluation. In ancient Greece, this gives rise to rhetoric, the study of how speech can be used to influence audiences. So writing at first could be used to improve and analyze oratory, and this form of study called rhetoric later became the basis of the analysis of all manner of written text, and therefore served as another forerunner of literary studies. Rhetoric is also the basis of the study of public speaking, and therefore became the foundation of the humanistic study of communication, starting out as speech and then speech communication and then simply communication. Literacy also made possible the study of thinking itself, as thought could be captured in writing and studied objectively. This is the kind of study that Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were engaged in, the study that we know as philosophy, and specifically what has been referred to as dialectics or logic. The Aristotelian logic that Korzybski criticized was a function of the ancient Greek alphabetic culture that developed in antiquity, and it represents a powerful tool, but only when used for certain limited tasks. Korzybski's non-Aristotelian system incorporates Aristotelian logic as a special case within a much larger framework, and it's Korzybski's system being based on empiricism and inductive reasoning, relying on facts and evidence, and taking into account the dynamic nature of reality that has come to light via modern physics. Now, as writing separates the message from the messenger, it becomes possible to study the message in isolation from its context. Aristotle, in his treatise on rhetoric, separated the ways in which speakers persuade their audiences into three categories. One was ethos, the appeal to ethical standing, prior reputation, and credibility. Another was pathos, the emotional appeal. And the third was logos, the appeal to reason and logic. While an effective orator would utilize all three, they also correspond to the three main elements in a speech situation. Ethos refers to the speaker. Pathos to the audience, because that's where the emotional impact of the speech will be. And logos to the message, logos referring to both words and logic. For Aristotle, the three were inseparable, because in public address, the speaker, the audience, and the speech itself are inseparable. But writing made it possible to isolate the speech in the form of a document and to study the message alone independent of its original context. In Plato's Phaedrus and elsewhere, he has Socrates criticize writing for this reason, as the text is no longer tied to its intended audience and could be read by anyone, anywhere, at any time. Moreover, the absence of the communicator, the speaker or writer, means that you cannot ask questions of a text. You cannot ask the text to explain its statements or provide evidence for its arguments or respond to criticism. This necessitated the development of those forms of interpretation, of exegesis and hermeneutics, and gave rise to the role of the teacher, the rabbi, the guru, whose function it is to interpret the text. His function it is to act as a proxy for the author in the absence of the original source. The invention of writing also resulted in a profound error about messages and meanings, a fundamental misconception about the location of meaning, namely that the meaning is in the message. In a face-to-face situation, it is quite clear that the meaning is in the communicators, in the speaker and in the listener, in the sender and in the receiver, in the orator or storyteller or singer and in the audience. And it is a basic rule in human communication that the message sent is not the message received. What that means is that the meaning of the message in the sender is not the same as the meaning of the message in the receiver, and the message itself cannot be isolated from the speakers and the listeners for the simple reason that the spoken word is ephemeral. Or, as Walter Ong puts it, Sound exists only when it is going out of existence. Sound is an event, not a thing. As Ong would explain, if I say the word permanence, by the time I get to nence, the syllables perma have disappeared and are gone forever, excepting, of course, the use of recording devices. But even when recorded, when you pause a video, you get a freeze frame, but the audio, when paused, yields nothing but silence. So writing transforms words from events into things to be studied and gives us the illusion that the meaning is in the words themselves. This is further reinforced by the use of writing to produce definitions of words and eventually to produce entire dictionaries. Many, including Korzybski, have made the point that definitions are tautologies and dictionaries are closed systems, because we define words by using other words and define those words with other words, eventually leading us back to the words that we began with. We can define meaning as a definition and then find that definition is defined as a meaning. And that's why foreign language dictionaries are of no use to us unless we already know the language. And moreover, Neil Postman argues against the tyranny of definitions, criticizing the tendency to refer to the definition of any term, given that definitions are human inventions and are always open to criticism and rejection and can always be replaced by alternatives. Echoing the literary scholar I.A. Richards, who wrote that, and I quote here, "No definition has any authority apart from a purpose or to bar us from other purposes." And so, echoing that, Postman's solution to the tyranny of definitions is to only refer to a definition, and never the definition of a word. Now, as for I.A. Richards, he famously addressed the topic of meaning in the book he co-authored with C.K. Ogden, entitled The Meaning of Meaning. In that work, Ogden and Richards present the basic model of the semantic triangle, which establishes that meanings are not in words, as the symbol in this model is the outward manifestation of the sign, whether it is in the form of a noise coming out of someone's mouth or a mark made on some kind of surface. The meaning, on the other hand, is separate from the symbol or word and exists as a thought or reference. The relationship between symbol and thought correspond to Ferdinand de Saussure's terms signifier and signified. But what's different and especially significant about Ogden and Richards' semantic triangle is that it does not present meaning as generated entirely from within the sign and within the code, but rather as a product of something external to the organism as the referent. The referent can be understood as the thing or object or event that exists out there in the world, independent of the individual. The referent is the thing referred to, and the relationship between the referent and the symbol is therefore indirect. It's mediated by the thought or reference, which is to say that it is mediated. That is, the relationship between the referent and the word is mediated by the meaning. Now, this is in contrast to the simplistic notion that words stand for things, and this also underscores Korzybski's insistence that words are not the things they represent. Words are not things. Now, the relationship between symbol and meaning is therefore a product of the context, which exists in relation to the referent, the external reality being referred to. What is meant by the word chair depends upon the specific situation in which the word is used. The room we're in, for example. the individuals who are present, along with that physical space. In other words, the meaning depends on the semantic environment. The context is generally quite clear in a face-to-face situation, and if it is not, it is easy enough to clarify by asking questions or waiting for further explanation. If you do not speak English, and I say the word cup and hand you a cup of tea, you can understand that cup may refer to the container or to its contents, or it represents the activity of drinking, among other possible meanings. And you can understand that further interaction will provide the necessary context for further clarification. Ogg explains that members of an oral culture do not ask about the meanings of words, about definitions, and find such questions to be, well, meaningless. You learn a language not by memorizing vocabulary lists and rules of grammar and syntax. You learn it by languaging, by speaking and listening and communicating with others in real-life situations, in context, and in what we by way of what we now call immersion. In other words, you learn through the pragmatics of language, its actual use in real, live, real-world contexts, situations, semantic environments. As the anthropologist Jack Goody explains, with writing, what writing does is it decontextualizes language. It takes language out of any specific situation or environment. And as an example, lists. Lists are one of the earliest innovations of the written word. Consider a list of animals such as dogs, cats, chickens, ducks, etc. In this list, the subjects are isolated from any kind of predicate that might help to establish a context. For a member of an oral culture, the response to such a list might be, well, what about them? What are they doing? Or what are you doing with them? What are you trying to say? In the absence of any context, the link between meaning and reality, between thought and actual referent, that link is severed. In Science and Sanity, first published a decade after The Meaning of Meaning, Korzybski acknowledged the importance of the concept of meaning as represented by the semantic triangle, and with it the understanding that meaning is not in symbols, it is in people, and that meaning is not a thing, it is an action or activity, and that meaning is a function of context, of what Korzybski referred to as the neurosemantic and neurolinguistic environment, and that the context that is essential for determining the meaning of a message is also related to its order of abstraction. Simply put, context will determine if by the word chair I am referring to the chair, to this chair, or that chair, or some other chair, or to a chair, that is to any chair, or to a particular type of chair, which is to say a specific category of chairs, or to the general category of chairs, chair in general, or even to the alternate meaning of chair as a committee head. It's become something of a cliche to say that general semantics is not semantics and that the two should not be confused, and whereas plain old semantics is about meanings and definitions, Korzybski maintained that general semantics is about meaning as a process and above all about evaluation. So importantly, in place of the term meaning, Korzybski used the phrase semantic reaction. We can therefore recognize that Korzybski's general semantics is, at least in part, and really in a large part, a form of behaviorism, and one that draws specifically on Ivan Pavlov's model of stimulus-response. As you may recall, Pavlov's famous experiment showed that dogs who naturally salivate when presented with meat could learn to associate the ringing of a bell with the presence of meat, and through that conditioned response would eventually salivate just at the sound of the bell alone with no meat present. The presence of meat, presumably the sight and smell of it, are signals of the meal they're about to eat. And salivation is a response to that stimulus, and it is what we refer to, was referred to as a signal reaction. A reaction to a signal. For the dogs, the bell became a signal as well, eliciting a similar signal reaction. A signal is perceived to be directly connected to what it represents, and a signal reaction is an immediate reflex reaction. For Pavlov, a symbol is a signal of a signal, and that distance means that it is not directly connected to what it represents. Instead, we understand the connection to be arbitrary, which is why we can use entirely different sounds to represent the same reference in different languages, and why symbols only mean what they mean because they are conventional. That is, a group of people accept that they mean the same thing. That's a tacit agreement, and whereas a signal reaction is an immediate reflex response, a symbol reaction involves processing, decoding, interpreting, and evaluating, and therefore is delayed, and it involves reflection. It is not a reflex reaction, it is a reflective reaction. Now, it would be easy enough to conclude that signals ought to elicit signal reactions, and symbols ought to elicit symbol reactions, and when the responses do not match the stimuli, problems occur. Now, that's true some of the time, but not all of the time. One of the evolutionary advantages of symbol use is the ability to elicit signal reactions in situations that require a quick response. For example, if I yell, "Look out!" and that allows you to act without thinking and avoid getting hit in the head, that's an advantage. Along similar lines, a symbol reaction, a delayed reflective reaction to a signal, can be quite advantageous. As for example, if you smell smoke, and rather than responding in a knee-jerk fashion by giving in to panic and running away, you instead take the time to consider whether to put it out yourself, call the fire department, warn others, or whether it's time to simply flee to safety, or whether it's caused by something like someone smoking or burning incense and therefore is not a problem at all. Now, signal reactions and symbol reactions are two different types of semantic reactions, and they indicate that the meaning is in us, not in the signal, not in the symbol. The meaning is in the response rather than in the stimulus. The bell that caused Pavlov's dogs to salivate is a signal of a signal. It is true, but it is not a symbol, for the simple reason that dogs are not capable of responding with a symbol reaction. It's the conditioned response that makes the bell a signal. It's in that conditioned response, and not in the nature of the bell as a stimulus. As far as the dogs are concerned, the bell is just another signal they're receiving from their environment. Now, it's important to distinguish Korzybski's behaviorism from that of psychologists such as B.F. Skinner, who referred to the mind as a black box that cannot be studied scientifically and therefore must be set aside. For Korzybski, mental activity is in fact a form of behavior. Semantic reactions are behavioral responses to stimuli. Thinking is behavior. Now, this is also true for the behavioral approach of George Herbert Mead as put forth in his seminal work, Mind, Self, and Society. That book is subtitled From the Standpoint of a Social Behaviorist, and it was published a year after Science and Sanity in 1934. Mead's approach is known as symbolic interactionism, and for Mead, it was entirely possible to include mental activity as a form of behavior, the activity of thinking, and the mind itself as behavioral phenomena. It follows that the meaning of meaning is that it is a response to a stimulus. Whether that response is observable behavior in the form of external action, or whether it's mental activity in the form of information processing and cognition, or internal feelings and thoughts. The stimulus itself may be external, but it can also be internal, a reaction to our own activity. It can be our feelings. But we can also react to our own reactions in self-reflexive fashion and react to our reactions to our reactions. And that is intimately associated with the process of abstracting. As we get higher in level of abstraction, we are reacting to our reactions, making statements about statements, and statements about statements about statements, and responding to responses of responses, and so on. It's certainly possible to understand how reacting to one's own reactions can lead to an awareness of self, awareness of mind and of consciousness, which is to say, the formation of self-consciousness, the consciousness of self. Simply having the ability to think about ourselves allows us to imagine ourselves as if from outside of ourselves, to imagine stepping outside of our own subjectivity. And then it becomes possible to imagine seeing ourselves as someone else may see us, to imagine how someone else may react to us, react to our actions, and to predict how they may react to our actions, to generalize how others may react to our actions, and thereby to plan accordingly. In this way, the self-reflexive responses made possible by symbol reactions serve to unlock our capacity for empathy. And empathy involves a degree of projection. This also accounts for the evolutionary development of theory of mind, as detailed by psychologist Simon Baron-Cohen. It's the instinctive theory that human beings, for the most part, develop the theory that others have minds just like our own mind. We apply theory of mind to other human beings, and quite generously we also apply it to other forms of life, and even to inanimate objects and natural phenomena. That's because we're prone to overgeneralizing. Empathy, though, and theory of mind underscore the powerful presence of identification in human symbolic activity. Korzybski addresses the problematic aspects of identification via General Semantics, while rhetorician Kenneth Burke, in response to Korzybski, maintained that identification is the main function of rhetoric and human communication. Now, once again, meaning can be understood as a spectrum of responses to various stimuli. The responses may be immediate, automatic, and active, which is to say, signal reactions. They may be delayed, reflective, thoughtful, which is to say, symbol reactions. Or semantic reactions may fall somewhere in between those two poles. And again, what makes a symbol and not a signal is not something inherent in the stimulus itself, it's in the response. For Suzanne Langer, symbolism and meaning underlie everything that human beings do. As we make meaning from art as well as language, from music and images via the process of sense perception, we even make meaning when we're asleep through the activity of dreaming. Behind all of these different forms is the basic human ability to engage in symbolic transformation, which for Langer is akin to Korzybski's semantic reaction. And for Langer, as Alexander Durig explains in his interpretation of Langer, for Langer, I quote, "Language is not the medium of meaning. Meaning is the medium of language. Thus it is the meaning that makes the symbol, not the symbol that makes the meaning." This is why Christine Nystrom, following Langer, argues that human beings are by nature meaning makers. We're symbolic first responders. Meaning is a construction not out of whole cloth, but out of the raw material of our environment, the process being based on learning and experience and on culture and intersubjectivity. Meaning is not information, I should add. As put forth by Claude Shannon, information theory allows us to measure the complexity of a message system, but does not provide any way to decipher its meanings. But information is still about a response to a stimulus. Simply put, the function of information is to reduce uncertainty, and uncertainty reduction is a type of semantic reaction. It is the receiver's uncertainty that is reduced or eliminated. As Gregory Bateson put it, information is news. And it's only news if it's news to me or if it's news to you. Information is news about difference, Bateson explains, and therefore is a difference that makes a difference. The recognition of difference is at its core the most basic of signal reactions. On top of this, Norbert Wiener's cybernetics can also be helpful here in recognizing that feedback loops form in ongoing interactions, so that the response to a stimulus may serve as a stimulus itself, eliciting more responses, which also become stimuli, eliciting other responses, and continuing on indefinitely. At a certain point, it may be difficult, even impossible, to differentiate stimulus from response, so that what we have is a system composed of interdependent parts interacting with one another. And with this we arrive at Bateson's ecology of mind, and with it an ecology of meaning. In the stimulus-response relationship, the system is often reacting to its environment, and the response is in some sense an adaptation to the environment. In this regard, Paul Watzlawick and his colleagues explain that biological functioning in its most basic form is all about communication. I quote from Watzlawick's book, Pragmatics of Human Communication. Watzlawick and his co-authors write, "Norbert Wiener once said about the world that it may be viewed as a myriad of to whom it may concern messages." And then they go on to explain that the impact of the environment on an organism comprises a set of instructions whose meaning is by no means self-evident, but rather is left up to the organism to decode as best it can. If to this consideration we add the obvious fact that the organism's reactions in turn affect the environment, it becomes apparent that even on the very primitive levels of life, complex and continuous interactions take place that are non-random and are therefore governed by a program, or to use an existentialist term, by meaning. End of quote. The organism receives messages, which is to say information from the environment, because the environment is characterized by difference instead of sameness. A stimulus, any stimulus, constitutes news about difference, and to the extent that it elicits a response, it is a difference that makes a difference. There are differences that are present in the biophysical environment, or what we sometimes refer to as the natural environment. There are differences that originate from the organism's activities within the biophysical environment, and that is essentially what we refer to as technology, and there are the differences that exist solely in the interior landscape of the mind that are associated with our symbolic activity and consequent semantic reactions. Marshall McLuhan, who was a student of I.A. Richards and recognized Korzybski as a fellow grammarian, once wrote that the meaning of meaning is relationship. This echoes Korzybski's argument that meaning is based on the relationships and structures of language and other symbol systems in their relationship to the relationships and structures of within the external environment that make up the external environment. Now, McLuhan also stated that the user is the content, which is another way of saying that the meaning is in the communicators, not in the message. And if the meaning is not in the message, what is there left to say about the message? Here we come to McLuhan's best-known saying, the medium is the message. And what did he mean by that? First, that it was a call to pay attention, that while we tend to ignore the medium and only pay attention to the content, it is the medium that has the greater impact on human affairs. Second, that the medium influences the content. What appears to be the same message is actually a different message with a different meaning if you hear someone next to you say it out loud, or if you read it in a book, or experience it at a cinema or on television in your home. What may seem to be the same image does not have the same meaning or effect if it is drawn with pencil or with pen or with crayon, or if it's painted with oils or with watercolors, or seen in its original or in a print reproduction or in a digital image. The same is true in three-dimensionals for a sculpture chiseled out of stone, different from one carved out of wood, different from one molded out of clay, and of course different from one produced via 3D printing. And the same melody becomes a different piece of music, a different message, if played on a saxophone or a sitar or on a Moog synthesizer. Now, third, that the medium must precede the content. The medium is what we construct the content out of. Before I can write a book or a note, I have to learn how to write. There has to be a writing system to learn. Before I can broadcast a message, there has to be the equipment needed both to transmit and to receive the signal. Before I can say anything meaningful, I have to know the language. Indeed, before babies learn how to speak, they first start to produce the vocalizations commonly called baby talk, usually when they're about 2 months old. That is the medium of speech, the sounds of speech, the phonemes. This signals the readiness to learn language, and through interaction with others, parents and caregivers, infants learn the significant sounds of their language. They learn its phonemes, which differ from one language to another. And only after gaining a basic mastery of the medium of sound do they then begin to learn the content of speech, that is, words and the rules for combining them. So fourth, there is no content without a medium. Content, messages do not simply exist in some kind of vacuum. They have to take physical form, either as matter, for example, in the form of a book, or as energy in the form of an electronic signal, or as nerve impulses in the brain. Information is a function. To inform is to reduce uncertainty. Information is not a thing that exists independently of some material basis, whether that basis is an integrated circuit, radio wave, piece of paper, a bit of noise coming out of someone's mouth, or a strand of DNA. Now, fifth is that the media we use play a leading role in human affairs, influencing the way that we think, feel, and act, influencing the way that we use our senses, our process of perception, how we experience our world, influencing us collectively, shaping our societies, cultures, and all of human history. And sixth, in regard to the medium as the message, it also means that media are not just tools and devices that we choose to use or not use. Rather, they are environments that we inhabit. Now, drawing on McLuhan as well as Korzybski and many other scholars, Neil Postman introduced the field of media ecology in 1968, and in his 1974 Alfred Korzybski Memorial Lecture, Postman explains, and I quote, "Media ecology is general semantics writ large. It starts with the assumption that people do their thinking and feeling not only in and through language, but in and through all those media which extend, amplify, and transform our senses. Further, media ecology assumes that what is important in understanding these processes is not so much the content of media, but the ways in which they structure our transactions with them. Media ecologists want to know what kind of environment we enter when we talk on the telephone, or watch television, or read a book. We want to know the answers to such questions as, at what level of abstraction does a medium operate? What aspects of reality does it isolate and amplify? What aspects of reality does it exclude? What is the nature of the information it gives? What are its spatial biases, its temporal biases? What does a particular medium require us to do with our bodies and our senses? In what directions does it encourage us to think? And how do such biases determine our relations with others and with ourselves? So now, in this passage, Postman provides just a taste of what the field of media ecology represents. And to be honest, I suspect that referring to media ecology as general semantics writ large was a bit of an exaggeration, but Postman incorporated general semantics within the field of media ecology, and there's no doubt that general semantics represents a very significant foundation for the field. And like Korzybski's non-Aristotelian system, media ecology represents a grand synthesis, one that is truly general in the sense that it can be applied to any given subject matter. That is why I gave my 2017 book entitled Media Ecology, I gave it the subtitle, An Approach to Understanding the Human Condition. In that book, I endeavored to provide a comprehensive summary and synthesis of media ecology as a field of inquiry or method that can be used to study any given subject matter. When Postman first introduced the field of media ecology, he defined it as the study of media as environments. More than a mere simile, this definition is technically redundant in that the term medium and the term environment are synonymous. A fish swims through the medium of water. Our eyes see through the medium of air and the medium of light. Microbiologists grow bacteria in the medium of agar or a similar substance. And whether it's a sample of an E. coli strain growing in a petri dish, or a bunch of lactobacilli in a cup turning milk into yogurt, we call that batch of bacteria, we call it a culture. In other words, contrary to the common view that media are products of culture, in media ecology, it is the understanding that it is culture that emerges out of a medium. A culture is situated within a medium. It grows and evolves inside of a medium or an environment. Cultures are the content of media, or as the anthropologist Edmund Carpenter put it, and he wrote, I quote here, "I think media are so powerful they swallow cultures. I think of them as invisible environments which surround and destroy old environments. Sensitivity to problems of culture, conflict, and conquest becomes meaningless here, for media play no favorites. They conquer all cultures." End quote. Now, given that the terms medium and environment are synonyms, and the observation that media function as environments, I've added a modest footnote to Postman's definition of media ecology as the study of media as environments. I add that it is also the study of environments as media. Could put it simply that media ecology is the study of media as media, and it's also the study of environments as environments. Whichever one you prefer, you can take your pick. But once again, as human beings, we live in three types of environments, and all of them are interconnected. First, there is that biophysical environment, otherwise referred to as the natural environment. It's the environment that is studied by scientists, the environment that's the focus of physics, chemistry, and biology. And then second is the technological environment. Technology is not exclusive to our species, as we mentioned before regarding Mumford. Rather, technology can be found throughout the animal kingdom, and in its most basic sense, I would suggest that technology refers to all of the ways that any kind of organism alters its environment, and that begins with its metabolism, what it takes in and then what it expels, and in its reproductive functions, sending copies of itself out into the environment to become part of its environment. Of course, our species has proven all too effective at altering our environment in myriad ways, and we have amply demonstrated, in case there ever was any doubt, that the alterations made to our environment are not necessarily ones conducive to our survival. In any event, as for the third type of environment, it is the environment that is more or less unique to humanity, the symbolic environment, which would include speech and language, ritual, art, and the like. Our environments, our media, constitute the conditions that we live under. In her best-known work, The Human Condition, the philosopher Hannah Arendt explains, and I quote, "In addition to the conditions under which life is given to man on earth, and partly out of them, men constantly create their own self-made conditions, which, their human origin and their variability notwithstanding, possess the same conditioning power as natural things. Whatever touches or enters into a sustained relationship with human life immediately assumes the character of a condition of human existence. This is why men, no matter what they do, are always conditioned beings. Whatever enters the world of its own accord or is drawn into it by human effort becomes part of the human condition. The impact of the world's reality upon human existence is felt and received as a conditioning force. The objectivity of the world, its object or thing character, and the human condition supplement each other, because human existence is conditioned existence. It would be impossible without things, and things would be a heap of unrelated articles, a non-world, if they were not the conditioners of human existence." End quote. So the human condition is the context or situation that we as human beings find ourselves in. Human life cannot be fully understood in isolation from its environment because it is shaped to a significant degree by its environment. That is why Arendt refers to us as conditioned beings. The medium or environment is the source of the messages that communicate to us, the stimuli that condition us, and our responses are, to a significant degree, conditioned responses, or conditional responses, if you like, and use Korzybski's preferred term. And in effect, what Arendt is arguing, paralleling McLuhan's point that the medium is the message, in effect what she's saying, I would put it this way, is that we create the conditions that in turn condition us. The changes that we introduce into our environment that alter the environment feed back into ourselves as we are influenced, affected, and shaped by our environment. The conditions that we make are used to create a buffer or shield against the conditions that we inherit, so that our self-made conditions are meant to stand between us and what we would consider to be the natural environment. In this sense, our self-made conditions mediate between ourselves and the pre-existing conditions that we operated under, which is to say that our conditions are the media of human life, and in mediating, in going between our prior conditions and ourselves, the new conditions that we create become our new environment. And then as we adapt to our new conditions, as we become conditioned to our new conditions, we stop paying attention to them so that they fade from view. As they become part of the routine of everyday life, they melt into the background. They go out of our conscious awareness and thereby become, for all intents and purposes, invisible to us. As Arendt explains, our conditions, which is to say our environments or media, constitute our objective reality. And as Korzybski explains, our meanings are our subjective responses to stimuli received from our environment, which is to say our conditions or media. So, as for our messages, what is objectively real about our messages, is the medium, which is to say the source of the stimulus. Not the content, but the medium is what is objectively real about the messages. And then what is subjective about our messages is not the content, it's their meaning, which is to say the response to that stimulus, the semantic reaction. That is what is subjective, and that is what the message is. Through human sciences such as media ecology and general semantics, we can gain a measure of our understanding of ourselves as organisms as a whole in an environment, to use Korzybski's phrase. We can gain a measure of control over our semantic reactions so that we might respond to our environment in a thoughtful, rational, and respectful manner, that we might communicate with clarity and precision, and above all, act like adults, find a way to achieve peaceful coexistence with one another, put an end to human suffering and oppression. And through this new sense of sanity, we might at last engage in the vital task of repairing and healing our fragile and precious planet Earth. Thank you.
You've been listening to our November 2024 episode of Semantic Reactions, featuring Lance Strate, talking about the message, the meaning, and the medium. If you like what you've heard, or even if you haven't, please consider becoming a member of the Institute of General Semantics if you're not one already. In addition to supporting our efforts, IGS members receive an annual subscription to our journal, etc., a review of general semantics, access to our online and in-person events, lectures, and seminars, and discounts on the books and audiovisual materials that we sell. Regular membership is only $50 and half off for students. Your membership and any additional donations you care to make will help to support our offerings and activities as we work to bring a measure of sanity to the world. The Institute of General Semantics is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to research and education on a wide range of topics. They include language and symbols, meaning and perception, communication and representation, media and technology, science and epistemology, creativity, and critical thinking. We are dedicated to making the world a better place through practical strategies for improving our semantic environment, individually and collectively. For more information about the Institute and our activities, and to become a member and supporter of our work, please visit our website at generalsemantics.org. That's generalsemantics, one word, .org. And this brings to a close our 27th episode of Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. This is Ben Houck, signing off, saying, we hope you'll join us next time. And until then, just remember this simple fact, that the map is not the territory.